In 1913, Argentina was one of the 10 richest countries on Earth. Richer by income per person than France, richer than Germany, richer than Italy, which is why so many Italians got on boats and went there. Buenos Aires had electric street lighting, an underground railway before most of Europe, and an opera house that still ranks among the finest in the world. Money moved there, so did people. Millions of them, from exactly the countries we now think of as rich. A century later, that country has defaulted on its sovereign debt 9 times, has lived through inflation measured in the hundreds of percent, and sits in the middle of the world's income table. Nothing was taken from it. No invasion, no occupation, no partition. Argentina is one of the very few countries in modern history to become substantially poorer relative to the world without losing a war on its own soil. So, what happened? The popular answers are all names. A leader, a party, an ideology, a foreign bank. Every one of those answers has a problem. Argentina has tried nearly all of them, left and right, state control and free markets, closed borders and open ones, and declined through all of it. Which is what makes this a genuinely useful case, rather than a political argument. If a country runs the full menu of available policies across a century and the trend line barely reacts, then the interesting variable is not on the menu. So what is it? That is what this episode is looking for. The thing that survived every government, every ideology, and every reform program and kept producing the same result. Hey, welcome back to the Rise Index. If you're new here, this is where we follow the numbers behind who makes what, who profits, and how economic power really moves. Great to have you. Today, what actually gets lost when a rich country goes poor? It is not the money. By the end of this episode, we will put 3 figures on the decline. What Argentina inherited, what it never built, and what it spent instead. And we will do it without naming a villain, because the honest reading of 100 years of Argentine economic history is that this was not done by one government. It was done by a pattern that survived every government. Start with the inheritance, because the size of it is the whole reason this story matters. Around the turn of the 20th century, Argentina's income per person was in the same range as Western Europe's, by some estimates ahead of it. The Pampas produced grain and beef at a scale almost nobody could match, and refrigerated shipping had just made it possible to sell that beef to Britain. Land, climate, a railway network built to move the harvest, and a rich customer at the other end. That is as good a starting hand as an economy has ever been dealt. And the world knew it. Between the 1870s and the 1930s, millions of Europeans emigrated to Argentina, Italians and Spaniards in the largest numbers. People do not cross an ocean toward a country they believe is failing. British capital built the railways. British ships carried the beef. And the wealth was conspicuous enough that a phrase is said to have circulated in Europe at the time: rich as an Argentine. Hold that image, because everything that follows is the story of how a country with that hand ended up here. So hold that thought, the best hand in the game. Now watch what a country actually has to do with it. Here is the uncomfortable thing about a great starting hand. It removes the pressure to build anything else. Compare it with the country from last episode. Korea in 1960 had no oil, almost no usable farmland, and nothing anyone wanted to buy. Its only path to a foreign currency was to make something a stranger would pay for. Argentina had a path to foreign currency that required no manufacturing at all. Grow it, ship it, get paid. When beef and grain prices were high, the country was rich without having to become good at anything new. Economists have a dry name for the pattern that follows, commodity dependence, but the mechanism is simpler than the term. It is not that resources are a curse, it is that a resource windfall removes the deadline. Why endure 20 painful years building an industrial base when the harvest already pays? Now, the caveat, because the lazy version of this story ends here. Argentina did industrialise substantially. Through the mid-20th century, it built factories, an automotive sector, an appliance industry, a large urban working class. The problem was not the absence of factories, it was what they were built to do. Argentine industry was built primarily to serve Argentina, behind tariffs aimed at the domestic market, insulated from foreign competition. It was import substitution. Make at home what you used to buy abroad. And here is the difference that decides everything. Korea's factories had to pass a foreign customer's judgment to keep their funding. Argentina's factories mostly did not. Same policy tool, the state supporting industry. Opposite discipline. One had an examiner who owed the company nothing, the other graded its own paper. So Argentina got industry without competitiveness, plants that could supply a protected home market and could not sell into a foreign one. When the commodity price fell and the country needed export earnings, the factories could not provide them. The inheritance was real. The machine was never built. That is figure 1 and figure 2. Which brings us to the third number, and it is not measured in dollars. Every country that borrows is really selling one thing, the belief that it will pay you back. That belief is an asset. It can be accumulated over decades and it can be spent very quickly. Argentina has defaulted on its sovereign debt 9 times since independence, 3 of those since the year 2000 alone. Now, defaulting is not automatically irrational. Countries default. It is a legal event, not a sin. Sometimes the alternative is worse. But repetition changes what a promise is worth. A country that has defaulted 3 times this century does not borrow on the same terms as one that has never defaulted. It pays a premium. And it pays that premium on everything, forever, including the borrowing it would need to build the machine it never built. And credibility does not only leak through defaults. For years, the official inflation figures published by INDEC, the National Statistics Agency, were disputed by private economists who measured something considerably higher. When the official number and the price in the shop disagree, people stop treating the official number as information. That is a quieter kind of default, and it is harder to cure than the debt kind. That is the trap, and it is worth saying slowly. To escape commodity dependence, you need to invest for years before the returns arrive. To invest for years, you need to borrow cheaply. To borrow cheaply, you need a reputation for keeping promises. And the crises caused by commodity dependence are exactly what destroys that reputation. The disease consumes the medicine. You can watch the same loop run in the currency. When a government cannot borrow, it prints. When it prints, prices rise. When prices rise, people move their savings into dollars, which pushes the peso down, which raises prices again. Argentina has lived through inflation rates that most economies see only in wartime, including a period in the late 1980s when annual inflation ran into the thousands of percent and a return to triple digits in the 2020s. Live with that long enough, and something breaks that no policy can quickly repair. People stop planning in their own currency. Savings leave. Long-term lending disappears because no bank will write a 30-year loan in money that might not exist in 30 years. That is why Argentina has almost no mortgage market to speak of, in a country where owning a home is as normal an ambition as anywhere else. Stay with that one, because it is the most concrete thing in this episode. In most middle-income countries, an ordinary family buys a house by borrowing over 20 or 30 years and paying it down with income. In Argentina, for long stretches, property has been bought in cash, in dollars. which means the ordinary route into home ownership does not run through a bank. It runs through having already accumulated the full price. Now think about who that favors. Someone who already holds dollar assets, someone who inherited, anyone whose wealth predates the last reset. Inflation is usually discussed as a price problem. It is also a distribution machine, and it runs in one direction, from people holding pesos and wages toward people holding dollars and property. Think of it this way. A currency is a shared story about what a number means. Argentina's story has been rewritten so many times that people stopped reading it and started keeping their savings in someone else's. Now, the part that makes this an economic story instead of a political one. Since the 1940s, Argentina has run through most of the available options: heavy state intervention, military governments, return to democracy, aggressive market liberalisation in the 1990s, including pegging the peso 1-to-1 to the dollar, default and devaluation, renewed state spending, then austerity again, left, right, and several things in between, and the long-run trend line barely notices which one is in office. That should tell us something. When every ideology produces the same outcome, the ideology is not the variable. What did stay constant was the position each new government walked into. It inherited an economy that could not fund itself, needed results before the next election, and therefore reached for the fastest instrument available: printing, borrowing, freezing prices, or fixing the exchange rate. Every one of those buys time. None of them builds an exporter. And each one, when it failed, cost a little more credibility, which shortened the next government's runway, which forced an even faster instrument. That is the shape of the decline, not a fall, a ratchet, each turn slightly tighter than the last, and each government arriving with less room than the one before. And there is a mechanism inside the ratchet that deserves naming, because it explains why the choices keep repeating, even when everyone involved knows better. A government that inherits a crisis has two options: fix the structure, which takes a decade, hurts immediately, and delivers its benefits to whoever is in office long after you have gone, or stabilize the symptom, which hurts less now, delivers visibly before the next election, and leaves the structure for someone else. Put like that, the pattern is not a mystery. It is what a rational politician does when the electoral cycle is shorter than the repair. And which country has the shortest patience for pain? The one that has already been through 5 crises. Each failed stabilization makes voters less willing to accept the next round of hardship, which makes structural reform less survivable, which makes the next government reach for the fast instrument again. The crisis does not just damage the economy, it consumes the political capacity to fix the economy. The 1990s peg is the clearest illustration. Tying the peso to the dollar did stop hyperinflation, genuinely and quickly. That was not nothing. But it also fixed the exchange rate at a level that made Argentine exports expensive, in a country that already could not export enough. The cure for one symptom deepened the underlying disease, and when it broke in 2001, it broke with a bank freeze, a default, and riots. Same pattern, a real problem, an instrument that treats the symptom, a bill that arrives later and larger. Before the verdict, 3 things this episode is not claiming, because this is a story people enjoy telling badly. First, it is not claiming Argentina is poor. It is a middle-income country with high literacy, world-class scientists, a large service sector, and one of the more educated populations in Latin America. The story is relative decline, not destitution. And relative decline is the more interesting phenomenon anyway. Second, it is not claiming foreign lenders caused this. External creditors and the IMF have been involved in nearly every Argentine crisis, and the terms attached have been contested, often fiercely, sometimes for good reason. But no foreign lender forced a country to spend a century failing to build an export industry. The crises were domestic in origin and international in resolution, and confusing those two is how the analysis goes wrong. Third, it is not claiming the people made a cultural error. That explanation is the laziest one available, and it fails the simplest test. The same population in the same country was among the world's richest 100 years ago. Nothing about Argentines changed. The structure of what their economy could sell did. And there is a fourth thing worth saying, because it complicates the story in a direction most retellings avoid. Argentina is not uniformly unproductive. Its agricultural sector is genuinely world-class, among the most efficient producers of soy, maize, and beef anywhere. It has produced Nobel laureates in science and medicine. It exports software. It has technology companies valued in the billions. So this is not a country that cannot do difficult things. It is a country whose difficult things have never been enough to carry the whole economy. It is because the macroeconomy keeps resetting underneath them. Think of it as a house with excellent rooms and a foundation that shifts every few years. You can admire the carpentry and still understand why nobody wants a 30-year mortgage on it. So, the three figures, as promised. What it inherited. A top 10 income per person in 1913, built on land, cattle, grain, and a wealthy customer. One of the best starting positions any economy has held. What it never built. An industrial base that could survive contact with a foreign customer. Factories, yes. Exporters, no. And that distinction, the same one that separated Korea's steel mill from Argentina's assembly plants, is the whole game. And what it spent. Credibility, 9 defaults, repeated currency collapses, and the accumulated evidence that an Argentine promise carries a risk premium. That is the asset that is genuinely gone, and it is the hardest one to rebuild. Here is the correction this episode exists to make. Argentina's decline is usually told as a story about waste. A rich country that spent its inheritance. That is not quite it. The inheritance was never the source of lasting wealth in the first place. Grain and beef made Argentina rich in an era when selling raw commodities to Britain was a viable path to a high income. That era closed. What Argentina lost was not its money, it was the ability to borrow the time it needed to become something else. Korea got that time by proving, quarter after quarter, that its firms could sell to strangers. Argentina spent that time explaining why this crisis was different from the last one. And notice how differently the two countries were able to treat their own currencies. Korea could run a national savings rate and direct it into industry because Koreans kept their savings in won. Argentines, after enough resets, keep a significant share of their savings in dollars, much of it outside the domestic banking system entirely. Estimates of Argentine held foreign assets run to very large figures relative to the size of the economy. So the money exists. It belongs to Argentines. It is simply not available to fund Argentine industry because its owners have watched what happens to money that stays. That is what a lost reputation actually costs. Not a higher interest rate on a bond. A country whose own citizens will not lend it their savings. And the lesson generalizes, which is why this episode is in this season at all. A resource windfall is not wealth. It is a deadline extension. What matters is what a country builds before it expires. Which raises an uncomfortable question for anyone watching a commodity boom anywhere. Lithium, gas, rare earths, food. The same structure is available to any country that finds something the world wants. The windfall pays the bills. The bills getting paid removes the urgency. And by the time the price falls, the decades in which you could have built something else have already been spent. Comfortably, and with everyone's approval. Argentina is not a warning about Argentina. It is a warning about what a good harvest does to the deadline. 2 episodes, 2 directions. Korea climbed. Argentina slid. Both stories turn on the same hinge. Whether the money coming in was forced to prove itself against someone who owed you nothing. And it is worth being precise about what that hinge is not. It is not democracy. Korea did much of its climbing under authoritarian rule, and Argentina slid under governments of every kind. It is not education, or work ethic, or natural resources where Argentina was better endowed on 2 of the 3. It is whether the economy contained a mechanism that could say no to itself. Korea's exam said no to firms. Argentina had no equivalent, not because nobody thought of one, but because every attempt to install one arrived in the middle of a crisis, and crises are when a country can least afford to let things fail. Which raises the question this season has been circling. If the old ladder is shorter and the old inheritance is worth less, where is the next growth actually happening? There is a continent where several of the world's fastest growing economies now sit. It is routinely discussed as if it were one country, which is the first mistake, and its growth is routinely treated as either a miracle or a mirage, which is the second. 54 countries. Different resources, different institutions, different colonial histories, different results. Some are growing on commodity exports. The Argentine pattern. Some are growing on services that skip manufacturing entirely, which is a route neither Korea nor Argentina had available. And the question we will bring to them is the one this pair of episodes has earned. Not, is it growing? Plenty of things grow. Is anything being built that survives the price falling? Next time on The Rise Index. The African economy is growing faster than the world. Which ones, how, and whether it lasts? This is The Rise Index. Subscribe and follow where power moves next.